Last video we talked about bearing pressure. Spread your weight over a big area and you don't sink. So what happens when the ground is so soft that even a wide board can't hold you up? That's the other half of the story, and it's where two terms get mixed up constantly, even by people who should know better. Hi, if this is your first time here, I'm Carlos. I spent 7 years as a geotechnical engineer, which means I spent a lot of time figuring out whether the ground under a building can actually hold it up. This channel is where I explain that stuff in plain English, starting with the basics. Let's do a quick recap. Bearing pressure is simply how hard a building pushes on the ground. It's the force a building concentrates onto the ground beneath. But knowing how hard you're pushing only tells half the story. You also need to know something about the ground itself. How much pressure can it actually handle before it fails? That limit is called bearing capacity. Pressure is what you're asking the ground to do. Capacity is what the ground is actually capable of doing. These two terms are completely different, and mixing them up is where a lot of confusion starts. The relationship is actually pretty simple. As long as the pressure you're putting on the ground stays below the ground bearing capacity, you're in good shape. Now, if you push past that limit, it doesn't matter how carefully you calculated the pressure, the ground gives away. Here's something most people don't know. Engineers never actually design right up to the soil's true limit. That true limit is called ultimate bearing capacity. That's the exact point where the ground would fail. Nobody builds to that number on purpose. Instead, engineers divide it down by a safety factor. Engineers design to what's called the allowable bearing capacity, a number well below the true breaking point. Why don't engineers design up to the limit, you ask? Well, because the world is full of surprises. Soil is never perfectly uniform. Construction never goes exactly as planned, and buildings sometimes end up heavier than the original design expected. That safety margin is what keeps small surprises from turning into real life failures. Let's take a look and see what happens when that margin doesn't exist. Remember that grain elevator I mentioned last episode? Here's the full story. The Transcona Grain Elevator near Winnipeg, Canada was built in 1913 to hold 1 million bushels of wheat. No one tested the clay beneath. They just assumed it would behave like the soil nearby. On October 18th, 1913, once the elevator was filled to about 87% capacity, the building started to sink. Within an hour, it had settled a full foot. Then it tilted, and it kept tilting for almost 24 hours until it stopped at 27 degrees from vertical. An entire grain elevator tipped over like a fallen domino. This is where everything we've talked about comes together. Engineers later calculated that the clay's true limit was almost exactly 6,120 pounds per square foot. The loaded building was pushing down with almost that exact same number. The pressure had reached the soil's ultimate capacity almost to the pound. Remember that safety factor we just talked about? This is exactly why it exists. Here's the twist. The building didn't collapse. That thick, rigid foundation held together so well that the whole structure tipped over in one solid piece instead of crumbling, which is what actually led engineers to save it. They emptied the grain, dug underneath the low side, and slowly jacked up the entire building back upright over the following months. The building is still standing today. It's still being used, and it became the single most famous proof in the real world that bearing capacity calculations genuinely work. On the next episode, we're putting these concepts to work. Have you ever looked at land and wondered, can I build there? I'll show you the first thing geotechnical engineers look for. If this sounds like something that interests you, press subscribe. Catch you in the next one.